This is Y376 International Political Economy, September 16, 2008. One of the most important theories in international political economy is the theory of hegemonial stability. The world's largest economy is called a hegemon. In the 19th century, the hegemon was Britain. After World War II, the United States was hegemonic. Hegemony often arises as a result of a global war. The countries that are defeated or are weakened by war tend to decline. Countries that are victorious or otherwise insulated from the effects of war tend to become hegemonic. The hegemon establishes regimes after global wars that are favorable to its own interests. The British did that after the war, the Napoleonic Wars that ended in 1815. The United States did that after the end of World War II in 1945. The British world regimes were based on the pound sterling as the key currency. They were also based on a gold standard, at least part of the time. The British unilaterally reduced tariffs through the abolition of the Corn Laws, and they set up an investment regime based primarily on rules for portfolio investment. There wasn't much foreign direct investment at the time. The U.S. Was a challenger country in the 19th century and tended to go off the gold standard whenever it felt that the gold standard was not in its interests. It went off the gold standard after the Civil War, or during the Civil War rather, and returned to it about 20 years later. It again went off the gold standard during World War I, and then went back on again later. And in 1971, the Nixon shock basically ended all possibility of a gold standard when the U.S. Disconnected the value of the dollar from the value of gold, and gold prices were allowed to float on the market. Currency backing by metal has been a big issue in American politics in the 19th century. It was a hot issue partly because the East Coast, which was always oriented towards Europe, favored the retention of the gold standard, whereby the mountain states, particularly Colorado, where there was enormous silver mining interests, tended to favor a bimetallic or silver standard based on the fairly, basically in order to get rich. The problem that this posed was the East Coast people felt that having two metals would result in kind of sloppy monetary policies, and they thought that was a bad idea, that the most responsible countries favored keeping the gold standard, and only irresponsible countries, as in the cartoon, Mexico, Japan, and China, favored going to two metals. And in fact, one major politician, William Jennings Bryan, was very firmly in favor of the bimetallic standard. He gave a famous speech in 1896, which you can get to by clicking on the Cross of Gold speech thing on this page. He was in favor of free coinage of silver at a ratio of silver to gold of 16 to 1. Bryan lost to McKinley in the 1896 election, but it was nevertheless a huge issue in American politics. One of the contributions of the theory of hegemonial stability is to explain the Depression partly in terms of the difficulty of handing off leadership from the British to the American hegemon. After World War I, Britain was really not up to the task of running the world economy, and the U.S. was unwilling to assume the burden. So part of the problems of the 1930s were connected with that difficulty of handing off control. The British, by the way, didn't really want to hand off control even after World War II, but they were forced to when their economy didn't recover as well as they hoped it would, and then they started to lose their empire after the so-called East of Suez. Now, the U.S., as we already discussed, established the Bretton Woods system, the IMF, the World Bank, and the GATT, which later became the WTO. and also the informal monetary regime based on the dollar as the key currency. There has been some challenges to U.S. leadership, but at the current moment, the U.S. still remains the number one economy in the world economy in terms of leading it. But the general theory says that as the dominance of the hegemon wanes, then the regimes that the hegemon has established will weaken, and challengers will be more and more successful in challenging the role of the hegemonic country. The weakening of the regimes also tends to hasten the decline of the hegemon, and that there may also be other factors besides war that change the relative distribution of power, including economic power. And, for example, unequal rates of growth can have the same effect as a global war on producing changes in the distribution of economic power. But if there is a war, there might be a new hegemon, and the cycle starts all over again. Strong hegemon gets weaker, regimes get weaker, hegemon gets even more weaker, and then you have some kind of crisis that returns you to a hegemonic leader. Okay, well, this is really relevant to us only because there were theories about the decline of U.S. hegemony in the 1970s connected with the end of the Bretton Woods regime and further challenges to the trade regime, the investment regime, and so forth during the 1970s. Subsequent events seem to indicate that the U.S. was not as weak relatively to other powers as the theory might have suggested. And in any case, the U.S. remains a leader, although there clearly is some sharing of power with other major industrialized countries through institutions like the G7, G8. So the questions are, for the current period, has U.S. economic power declined relative to potential challengers? Has that decline resulted in weaker regimes and greater international economic stability? And which of the potential challengers to U.S. hegemony has the best chance of becoming the next hegemon? This chart shows how power is distributed within the advanced industrialized countries, and you can see that the G7 countries have stayed fairly constant in terms of total power, roughly 80%, a little bit less. The U.S. has declined relative to other countries, and then the G6, that is the G7 minus U.S., has risen somewhat over this period. So there's more power sharing among the G7 than there used to be, which is driven really by the recovery of Western Europe and Japan in the 60s and 70s. I'm going to turn now to the history of U.S. trade policy, and particularly the impact of the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930, which everybody seems to agree helped to deepen the Depression because of the high tariffs and the retaliation against the high tariffs that the U.S. instituted at that time. Franklin Roosevelt and his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, favored free trade for the post-World War II period, partly because they were looking back at what happened in the 1930s. In 1947, Congress rejected the International Trade Organization treaty that was proposed at Bretton Woods, and the GATT became the main trade regime. The main rules of the GATT include non-discrimination among members of the GATT under the so-called most favored nation principle. What it means basically is you have to treat all the members of the GATT as you treat the most favored nation. And that means that tariffs have to be adjusted to reflect the lowest tariffs that you're charging other members of the GATT. Also, as part of the GATT, you agree to participate in periodic multilateral trade negotiations to lower tariffs and non-tariff barriers. This shows all the multilateral trade negotiation rounds that have occurred since 1947. And you can see that the latest round is the Doha round that began 2000-2001. The biggest tariff reduction in this list of rounds occurred in the Kennedy round in the 1960s, And the Tokyo round is notable for beginning discussions of non-tariff barriers very seriously. As tariffs were reduced, some countries substituted non-tariff barriers for tariff barriers. And so the trade talks tended to focus more on non-tariff barriers than they had previously. In the Tokyo round, for example, non-tariff barriers were added to tariffs as a major discussion, along with conflict resolution methods and methods of settling trade disputes. The 5 types of non-tariff barriers that were discussed at Tokyo included subsidies, government procurement, standards, customs valuation barriers, and licensing barriers. Here's an example of a subsidies dispute that's still going on between the United States and Europe. The United States claims that Europe has subsidized the Airbus consortium, the company now called EADS, E-A-D-S, which builds the Airbus wide-body jets. Airbus basically displaced McDonnell Douglas as a commercial aircraft producer and is now the only major competitor to Boeing aircraft.